Hi, my name is Greg Pearson. These are my good friends, Weigh In and Topher Brown.
We're going to show you that all fly casts are governed by the same principles.
We'll help you understand what makes a cast work so you can figure out how to improve your own casting. We'll show you how to make Spey casts with single and double-handed rods, long and short belly lines, floating lines, and heavy sink tips. We'll show you the advantages of Scandinavian, Pacific Northwest, and traditional styles.
We'll teach you a variety of casting tools that will allow you to fish more effectively.
This is a DVD about Spey casting, but Spey casting is just a different style of fly casting in general. And what we'd like to convey on this DVD is the mechanics of what govern fly casts in general, be they overhead fly casts or Spey casts. One of the most common terms in fly casting is the term loop. What is a loop? Well, a loop is nothing more than the shape of the fly line as it unrolls after it's been cast. There's three parts to the fly casting loop. There's the top leg of the loop, and a bottom leg. Now between the two, the top and the bottom leg, is the leading edge of the loop. Now if the top and the bottom legs of the loops are pretty close together, the leading edge of the loop is narrow. It's what we call a tight loop. On the other hand, if the distance between the top leg and the bottom leg of the loop is wide, the leading edge is wide, and this is what we call a wide loop. Now there's a third type of loop where the top leg crosses the bottom leg and results in what we call a tailing loop. Now what determines what type of loop you cast? It's the path of the rod tip during the casting stroke. The start of the casting stroke occurs when the rod starts bending in a meaningful way, contributing to the fly cast. And the end of the casting stroke is when you stop applying energy to your fly cast. Now it's important to understand what causes different loop shapes, because this has implications in fishing. If your fly rod tip travels in a fairly straight line during your casting stroke, you end up with tight loops. Generally, a tight loop is quite efficient because it cuts through the wind very nicely and delivers most of the energy that you put into the rod into the line and lets the line unroll. If the rod tip starts low, goes high, and goes low again, we end up with big, wide open loops. You may want to cast a wide loop if you have a big, heavy bug on there, split shot, big indicator, and if you're casting a tight loop, it might cause some tangles. If we apply our power inappropriately, causing the rod suddenly to bend during the casting stroke, we get tailing loops. So if we apply power or energy appropriately during the casting stroke, the rod tip travels in a fairly straight line and we get reasonably tight casting loops. One of the important things with fly casting is timing. What we'd like to have is all our movements proceeding fairly smoothly. And timing in overhead casting basically means allowing whatever cast you're making, whether it's a back cast or a forward cast, to unroll. The longer the amount of line I have out, the longer I'm going to have to wait before I start my next cast, be it a forward cast to a back cast or a back cast to a forward cast. All timing is pausing, letting the line unroll before we actually start moving it in a different direction. Another important concept is the concept of casting plane. If we have the back cast and the forward cast moving fairly opposite each other, we can change the plane of the cast in any direction we'd like. We can have a fairly overhead casting plane, or we can move the plane sideways. We can even move the plane horizontally, as long as the back cast is fairly opposite the forward cast. What we want to do is apply energy to the cast steadily. We want to have the fly rod tip accelerate from the start of the casting stroke to the end of the casting stroke. We start moving the fly line, accelerate that fly line by accelerating the rod tip, and at the very end of the casting stroke, we want to suddenly stop the rod at the time it's actually moving the fastest. What this causes is the line to be dragged through the air during the casting stroke, and at the end of the casting stroke, when we suddenly stop the rod, the fly line simply is catapulted over the tip of the rod, resulting in a good, nice, tight loop. One of the other key things in single hand casting as we get better is to get the left hand, in this situation, my non-casting hand, into the picture and actually contributing to the cast. One of the ways we can do that is with something called a haul. And basically, what we're doing with the non-casting hand, or my left hand here, is increasing the line speed during the casting stroke. Now the casting stroke starts with the rod not moving, and then we start accelerating that rod tip, and suddenly, at its point of maximum acceleration, we stop it. Well, that's the exact same movement and speed and timing that we use for the other hand, in this case my left hand, pulling the line during the casting stroke, in a mirror image to what we're doing with our casting hand. What the haul does is it accelerates the line during the casting stroke, adding line speed without having to make your casting hand work any harder. The haul allows us to cast further. It allows us to cast tighter loops. The haul starts with the hands fairly close together, and the hands move apart during the cast, whether it's a forward cast or a back cast. I'm accentuating this so that you can see what the hands are doing. This isn't the length or size of haul that I would normally use for this amount of line. One of the other very important principles with all fly casts is that our casting stroke length, the distance between the start of the casting stroke and the end of the casting stroke, is proportional to how much line we're actually casting or carrying. Here, with a relatively short line, I can have a fairly short casting stroke. If I shorten the line even further, my casting stroke length actually decreases even more. On the other hand, if I lengthen the amount of line that I'm carrying, the casting stroke length has to increase significantly. What I'm doing here is I'm just casting line over the rod tip, false casting back and forth. And notice that the line is actually traveling over the rod tip as it's being cast. What I'm going to start doing now is fiddling around with my back cast a little bit. Just on my back cast, I'm going to cast the line under the rod tip. I'm still doing the same thing on my forward cast. Even though the back cast now is going underneath the rod tip, the same principles and mechanics apply to the forward cast that we discussed. If my rod tip travels in a fairly straight line path during my forward casting stroke, my loops are pretty tight. On the other hand, if my rod tip starts low, goes high, and then goes low again, we're going to get an open loop. So even though my back cast is under the rod tip, if my rod tip on the forward cast, the path that it's taking, isn't straight, we can get wide open loops. If the rod tip path is fairly straight, we tighten up our loops. And the same thing happens with regards to the generation of those tailing loops. When the rod tip starts high, goes low, and then goes high again, we'll still get these tailing loops every time. With my back cast under the rod tip, I can manipulate the size of the back cast loop so that my back cast loop gets wider and wider. And at a certain point, it's going to get wide enough so that the end of the line and leader will touch down actually on the water. Now, when my back cast loop gets that wide and the end of the line and leader touch down on the water, what does this look like? A Spey cast. So now, we've gone from casting overhead to casting our line underneath the rod tip to casting Spey cast. Because I'm casting the line underneath the rod tip, I'm no longer casting purely in a vertical plane. When we're overhead casting, we can cast fairly vertically. The plane of the cast is fairly straight up and down. If I'm casting my line underneath the rod tip, notice that my back cast is now no longer vertical. And in order for me to maintain everything as lined up as possible, my forward cast also now has to go from vertical to off vertical, or slightly off to the side. So when I'm making these Spey casts, my forward casting plane is no longer straight up and down. It's a little bit off to the side because that's the plane of my back cast. Now, if you try to make a fly line go too many different directions at once, it doesn't like it. So if I'm making my back cast off the vertical plane, if I try to still make my forward cast vertical, what happens is the loop gets mixed up. It doesn't know where to go. So one of the most important things when we're casting here is to make sure that if we get our back cast off the vertical plane, our forward cast also has to come off the vertical plane. So when we make this cast underneath the rod tip so that the end of the line and the leader land in the water, when that line and leader lands in the water, that's called an anchor. It's really important how and what shape and in what way the end of the line and the leader land on the water. This actually looks deceptively simple, and it seems like it's fairly straightforward, but it turns out that it is critically important to be able to control not only where, but how the end of the line and the leader, or the anchor, land on the water. What we would like is to have, ideally, the line, end of the line and the leader land pretty much right opposite our casting shoulder. And to do that, we have to gauge very carefully how much energy we put into our back cast. If I put too much energy into my back cast, I'll either not have an anchor form at all, or the anchor will land too far behind me. And that's no longer a Spey cast. The contrary is if the anchor doesn't come up to where I want it here and is too far in front of me or too far downstream, it makes it really hard to make a forward cast. It's just a mess. It's no longer a smooth flowing cast. If I put just enough energy into my back cast so that the anchor lands pretty much right opposite my casting shoulder every cast, what we'd like is the end of the line and leader to land as smoothly as possible, like an airplane landing on a tarmac or maybe a duck landing on the water. It's all nice and smooth. We'd also like the line and leader to land in a straight line. We don't want it to get all crumpled up, because if it gets all crumpled up, what we call a crashed anchor, the forward cast is going to be affected. If the line lands crumpled up, a lot of times, even though you make a decent forward cast, the end of the line and leader and your fly won't turn over. Now, how do we actually accomplish these smooth movements to end up with good Spey casts? When we're making these back casts underneath the rod tip and putting the fly right back where it started, just like a pickup and lay down for an overhead cast, this is called a switch cast. And when we're making these switch casts, just like any Spey cast, it has to be done smoothly. There's actually 3 parts to a switch cast. The first is called the lift. We have to clear a little bit of line off the water and get the end of the line moving a little bit. Simply lifting the line and the rod in almost a horizontal position. We just want to break a little bit of that water tension off the line so that we can start making our back cast under the rod tip. So the first part is a lift, and then we transition into our back cast so that the end of the line and leader land just opposite our casting shoulder. The third part to our cast is the forward cast. And it's the exact same mechanics that we talked about before. Just remember that we don't want to be too vertical here. We want to be a little bit off to the side because we're casting the back cast under the rod tip. One of the most important things with the switch cast or any Spey cast is that at the end of the back cast, our rod tip, meaning our hand also, must rise before we actually start our forward cast. So the 3 parts of the cast, lifting, making the back cast, and the forward cast, flow together seamlessly. Once we put these 3 parts of the cast together, what we have is a switch cast, and we're able to generate smooth back cast loops, smooth forward loops, and we have the most control over how our anchor lands smoothly and consistently. There's a couple of things that we can do with our casts to improve our casting efficiency. Since we're making the back cast underneath the rod tip, what we can actually now do is incorporate some of our big muscles, our core trunk muscles, the torso. So what we can actually do here is use a little torso rotation during our back cast and forward cast. What this starts to do is put a little bit of additional energy into our casts and improves the efficiency of the cast. We can add a haul to our forward cast. That'll increase our line speed on the forward cast. And in addition to the torso rotation, can increase the efficiency of our casting, we can also add a haul to our back cast, so we're actually double hauling a spey. Now the last thing that we can do to add efficiency to our cast is shift our weight during the cast. So for our back cast, we'll shift our weight back, and we'll start our forward cast by shifting our weight forward. If we put all these three things together, improve your casting efficiency, they can improve your casting consistency, and certainly they can decrease fatigue. Earlier I was showing you casts with a 9-foot 5-weight trout rod. We actually pick up a bigger rod, like this 10-foot for 7-weight, which may be more appropriate for steelhead fishing in a bigger river like this. What we find is that the rod's just too big for us to cast with one hand alone. That's where those other parts, the body rotation, the weight shift, and the haul become so important, because they allow you to deliver longer casts, take less energy to make it so, and increase the efficiency of the whole operation so you can fish for longer. So when I'm casting a bigger rod, heavier line, what I'm really focusing on is weight shift and body rotation, starting my cast, and the arm kind of finishing it. I'm also focusing on timing of my haul and making sure my haul matches my back cast and forward cast stroke length. Basically putting together all those mechanics that we talked about to maximize the efficiency of the casting. So if you understand how to make a good back cast, and you understand how to control your anchor, you can do any of the spey casts. That includes a switch cast, which we've been focusing on. It includes the single spey. But it also includes all sorts of other casts, like the snake roll. A circle cast. A spiral single. And all sorts of other casts which may not necessarily have names, but they all share a back cast under the rod tip before the forward cast goes out. And they're all governed by the exact same mechanics that we've talked about. When the fishing situation calls for working with a longer rod, like this 16-foot 10-weight, even though it's an incredibly light rod, it's still 16 feet long. In order to make this rod load or bend in a meaningful way during the casting stroke, we really need to use two hands. The two hands work opposite each other to exert leverage to make the rod bend. In concept, they work identically to the way the hands work when we're double hauling for a single-handed rod. The timing, the application of power, the acceleration of the fly rod, and the sudden stop at the end of the acceleration or end of casting stroke is identical to double hauling. Some casters like to use more of a haul and less with the upper hand or casting hand. Some casters like to use more with their upper hand and less haul. Other casters like to use a balance of both. It is the exact same when we're casting with a two-handed rod. Some people like to use more bottom hand, some people like to use more top hand. It doesn't matter as long as you're able to execute the fundamental mechanics that make the fly cast work. What we don't talk about and what we really don't believe is that there's one specific grip or one specific stance that's best. If you understand what makes a fly cast tick, you can actually execute these things with a grip and a stance that's comfortable for you. The critical and most important part of all spey casting is anchor control. Where your anchor lands and how it lands. Because the anchor really dictates where you can cast. We're always going to cast a little bit more towards us from the anchor, meaning our cast is going to be directed somewhere between the anchor and ourselves. We can't cast across our anchor, otherwise the line will cross over itself. So if you can control where the anchor lands, you'll be able to control where you want to cast. The switch cast, which is the equivalent of the overhead casting pickup and laydown, is at the same time the simplest conceptual spey cast, but it also turns out to be the most difficult to master. It's very, very important to get good at switch casting because switch casting has all the fundamental components that will be found in every other spey cast. There are three parts to the switch cast. The first is the lift, where we clear the line off the water, breaking water tension on the line and starting to get the end of the fly line moving. Once we finish our lift, we transition smoothly into a back cast where the line is cast underneath the rod tip in such a fashion that the end of the line and leader lands smoothly or set down smoothly, transiently, right opposite our casting shoulder. Right when that happens, we start with our forward cast. Now the mechanics with a two-handed rod are identical to the mechanics which we covered with a single-handed rod. It's important that we do all three parts very smoothly, like a medley, one song flowing into another. When we make the lift, we don't want to lift our rod tip straight up because what this does is cuts down the stroke length of our back cast. It also makes the plane of our back cast aim downwards because you can't get any higher than this. When we make a good lift, what we want to do is try to keep the rod as horizontal as possible, yet still clearing a little bit of line. What this allows us to do with our back cast is direct it behind us, underneath the rod tip, and not downwards towards the water. Just like with the single-hand spey, placement and the shape of the anchor is critical. You'll know when you're getting good at spey casting because you'll be able to consistently place your anchor and also control how it lands. Remember, we want the anchor to land smoothly like an airplane setting down on the tarmac. You can imagine your day's going to be a lot better if the anchor lands smoothly as opposed to landing in a big old heap. When we're casting with a two-handed rod, it's very, very important to not just cast with your arms because at the end of a long day fishing, if you're only using your arms, you're going to be really tired. If there are ways that we can use our large trunk muscles in our body to help us with our cast, and then just use the arms for the finesse part of the casting, at the end of the day we'll be less tired, and actually throughout the course of the day you'll be able to fish more effectively. After our lift, we can use body rotation both in our forward and back cast to take most of the work off our arms. If we combine body rotation with weight shift, we get even more energy to the cast from our body and less with our arms. Now it doesn't matter whether you stand right foot forward or left foot forward. That's immaterial. What's more important is the concept of weight shift and body rotation. Now we start the cast with weight shift. The next thing that happens is body rotation, and the hands and arms finish the cast. Once we've made our back cast and we've stopped applying energy to the back cast, what we want to do is slide our rod and hands into a position for our forward cast. We want to drift the rod tip up and back before our forward cast. The rod tip really must rise after the back cast before the forward cast. The single spey is also conceptually a very simple cast, but also is one of the most difficult to execute well. Because it embodies all of the fundamental principles that we've talked about during the switch cast, the single spey is a great cast to practice. It is also a phenomenal and very useful fishing cast. Now the only difference between the switch cast and the single spey is a change of direction. And what we're going to do for the single spey is after our lift, we're going to rotate our body towards the direction where we want to cast the line. Everything else, the back cast underneath the rod tip, getting the end of the line and the leader to anchor transiently opposite our casting shoulder, and our forward cast mechanics don't change. What I'm casting right now is a 16-foot, 10-weight LS2 Scott rod. I've got an XLT line, and I've cut it so the orange part, which is the part that you can see near the end of the rod, is about 100 feet long. What I'm going to show you is something called a snake roll cast. This is one of the most useful casts you will ever learn. It was actually invented by a friend of mine, Simon Gosworth. Like all the Spey casts, it shares a final back cast underneath the rod tip. It shares placing the anchor opposite your casting shoulder, and it shares the same forward cast mechanics, but how you get there is a little different. The snake roll is a cast that gives us an anchor which is on the downstream side of us, unlike the single Spey, which gives us an anchor which is on the upstream side of us. This is what one looks like. So we lift this way, come across, and we have the same concept with an anchor that's opposite our casting shoulder. And as soon as that anchor lands, we're going to go ahead and pull the trigger on our forward cast. It's very important with this cast to make sure that everything stays away from you. Think about the plane or a cast occurring in a cone that's directed about 45 degrees away from your casting shoulder. If our cone starts getting really big here, the fly is going to land near you, and when you make the cast, it's going to hook you like this. Ow. So one of the most important things is don't practice with a big 3-0 fly on there, just practice with a little bit of yarn. This cast is one of the single most useful fishing casts that you'll ever see. It allows us to change a huge direction with one move. If our line is downstream of us and we want to cast 90 degrees, 45 degrees, 135 degrees, we can do all of that with this cast. This cast is also phenomenally useful for casting heavy, heavy sink tips, because that initial lift move and the move coming over the top here is great for lifting big old heavy sink tips out of the water. One key part to this cast, and it's a little bit different than some of the other Spey casts, is that our body starts out and stays throughout most of the cast facing where the line starts out, downstream. It doesn't necessarily start out facing the direction where we want the fly to go. So here's the line downstream of me. I want to cast straight out this way. I'm going to make my lift towards the bank, come over the top. Once I'm happy with the anchor, I'm going to go ahead and cast that line out. Now, a very useful variation of the single Spey was developed by my good friend Steve Choate. What Steve did was be inspired by Simon Gosworth's snake roll cast, and he adapted that spiral pickup move and tagged it on top of a single Spey cast. This is a very useful cast, especially if you have roily currents that might be grabbing the end of your fly line like we have here, or if you have a heavy sink tip. This allows you to pick up the fly and the end of the line and the leader a little bit easier than you normally would with a single Spey. The spiral single is made and starts with a lift just as we would make for our single Spey. But the first move, before we make our back cast, is a move away from the direction of our back cast. Once we make that move over the top, away from our back cast, everything else proceeds just as if it was a regular single Spey. We talk about the timing of these types of casts, like the switch cast and the single Spey, because the anchor transiently lands on the water and is the mark for the initiation of the forward cast. As a matter of fact, because we want a minimum amount of time in which the anchor is landing on the water or spends on the water, we call these kiss and go casts. Because the anchor kisses down, boom, we go with our forward cast. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about backcast loop control. Just like overhead casting with a single-handed rod, if you have a big, wide open loop in your backcast, it's kind of hard to make a nice, tight forward cast loop. It's much easier to balance the forward and back casts a little bit so there's nearly equal energy into the back cast as the forward cast. Spey casting, by definition, is asymmetric. You're not going to have as much energy into your back cast because you want your line and leader to land just opposite your casting shoulder before you make your forward cast. Just as the most efficient loop shape for any fly cast is a tight, narrow loop, what we'd like to try to do is impart that into our back cast loop. We talked about the position and the path and the plane of the rod tip and the application of energy appropriately during the casting stroke so that we get tight loops with overhead casting. This is no different. The only difference is that we're actually casting the line underneath the rod tip. Now, just like the overhead cast, if we're able to manipulate and control the shape of our back cast loops, there are times when it would be advantageous to have a fairly shallow, wide back cast loop. For example, if we're casting right against some trees behind us, we don't want a narrow, tight back cast loop because that'll carry further behind us. So that's one situation where you might want to have a fairly shallow, open back cast loop. Imagine trees all behind me. If I'm able to make a fairly wide, shallow loop, there's less chance that I'm going to get tangled up in the trees. With all spey casts, there's actually a back cast and it's made underneath the rod tip. If the trajectory or where the back cast loop is directed too far downwards, you'll have too much of the bottom leg of your loop stuck on the water. This will again make forward casting very difficult. Another back cast problem is if we shortchange the under the rod tip part of the back cast. This is a problem that we see quite a bit with really, really good single-hand casters trying to make the transition to spey casting. We're kind of cutting the corner on our back cast rather than really casting that back cast under the rod tip. What this causes is difficulty in placing our anchor. Ideally, what we want is the shape of our back cast loop to be smooth. Whether it's rounded or tight, we don't want to have a lot of squiggles in it, and we want it to be smooth. The bottom leg of the back cast loop, which is actually the moving leg of the loop, ideally should have kind of half of the shape of a parabola. Where the anchor is going to land should be fairly flat and then transition up to the point of the end of the back cast loop, or the leading edge of the back cast loop. If we wait too long after our anchor lands, the bottom leg of our loop will settle onto the water, making it very difficult for us to make a forward cast because we've got simply too much line on the water. Another problem with the anchor is if it doesn't land smoothly. If it doesn't land smoothly and lands in a big old heap, that can compromise leader turnover and fly turnover on your forward cast. If you see your fly cast on your forward cast falling down at the end, many times the cause of that is a crashed anchor where the anchor didn't land smoothly. Now I'm going to talk about a fairly subtle anchor problem on a single spey. And that's where, even though your back cast might be lined up opposite your forward cast, your anchor is still facing in the direction of downstream or where the fly came from. This can cause the loop, forward casting loop top leg, to cross over the bottom leg. This is a fairly subtle problem, and to correct this problem, what you want to do is make sure that you rotate your body before you actually make your back cast. Rotate in the direction of your forward cast. But what probably distinguishes the traditional style from the Scandinavian Skagit styles more than anything else is the type of line used. What I'm casting is a long belly fly line called the Scientific Anglers XLT. The belly length, or head length so to speak, on this line is about 100 feet long. It's quite a bit longer than any Scandinavian or Skagit style setup. The big advantage of a traditional style of casting is that we don't have to do a lot of stripping and shooting. Theoretically, our fly can certainly spend a lot more time in the water. An advantage of a traditional style is that I can make a cast and fish a run without having to strip and shoot. Even with this relatively short length of line out, with a Scandinavian or a Skagit style system, I'd be stripping and shooting before I make my next cast. But with a traditional style, all I have to do is just pick it back up again and cast it back out. There's a range of distances as well that are available to me. If I put the whole head out to where I've spliced running line here, or shooting line at the end of the head, so to speak, or the belly, I can still just pick it up and pop it out without having to strip and shoot. Now I have 100 feet from this section here to the end of my fly line, plus about 15 or 17 feet of leader. Even with a longer line like that, all I have to do is pick it up, make a cast. At the end of my run, I don't have to strip and shoot again. I can just pick it up and pop it right back out again. This is a very efficient way of fishing because your fly spends the most time in the water and there's not a lot of accessory movements. If I want to make a longer cast, that actually has the end of the fly line beyond the tip of the rod, what I can do is I can treat this longer belly line just like I would a shorter head. I strip my shooting line back to where I made my splice at the end of the belly and simply treat this like a very long version of a Skagit or Scandinavian system. But that's 120 feet of fly line plus the 17 feet or so of leader, and I don't have to strip nearly as much or deal with nearly as much running line or shooting line as I would if I was casting the same distance with a Skagit or a Scandinavian system. You might find it ironic, as I do, that an Asian American guy from Washington State is talking about traditional spey casting techniques. But that's one of the beautiful things about spey casting. It really is worldwide.
The Scandinavian spey cast should ideally be taught by a 6'4" blonde Viking who speaks in a monotone and eats lutefisk. In the absence of that, you'll have to make do with me. The Scandinavian spey cast evolved in conjunction with the use of shooting heads when fishing for Atlantic salmon and sea trout in Scandinavia. The rivers in Scandinavia often have very little room for a back cast, and yet you still need to make a long cast in order to cover the holding water. The Scandinavians needed a tackle system that would solve this problem, and the shooting head was the answer. Shooting heads vary in length from around 35 to 45 feet, and they're available in floating as well as sinking versions. Shorter shooting heads are generally used when you don't have much room to make a back cast. They're also used for big angle changes on the river. Longer shooting heads are used primarily for distance casting, or if you have more room behind you to make the cast. The rods are generally 12.5 to 15 feet in length, and they're medium fast to fast in action. And the last component of the system is the leader. The leader is the primary anchor for the Scandinavian Spey cast with a floating shooting head. It allows the angler to present a fly with a minimum of water disturbance, and they're generally from 15 to about 20 feet in length, and sometimes longer. The Scandinavian Spey cast is essentially a short-stroke single spey. However, any of the kiss-and-go casts that are normally used in spey casting can also be employed with this method. Stroke length is fairly constant, as the amount of line that you have beyond the tip of the rod is fixed. Overhang is defined as the amount of running line that you have beyond the tip of the rod. Overhang is critical to casting shooting heads successfully. If you have too much overhang, in other words, too much running line out beyond the tip of the rod, it becomes very difficult to control the line when you're making a change of direction cast. The correct amount of overhang is generally about a yard of running line beyond the tip of the rod, is just about perfect for most Scandinavian-style spey casting. The top hand on the Scandinavian-style spey cast is generally lower, and the bottom hand is more active than with traditional spey casting styles. The forward stop is generally higher in order to achieve a tight loop, and distance is achieved by shooting line. As the Scandinavian spey cast is primarily a short stroke single spey, it's important when making the angle change where you want to cast to use your hips to make that change and not your arms. The sequence of events is generally your hips first, then throw your back cast. Start by lifting the rod, lifting some of the line out of the water, making a turn with the hips, throw the back cast, and then make the forward cast. It's critical that you use your hips to make this turn so that you don't throw the line too far upstream, which will make that angle change virtually impossible. There are many advantages to the Scandinavian style of spey casting. Shooting heads are fairly short, and because they're so short, they're very lightweight. In fact, they're about half the weight of a standard long belly spey line. If you're making thousands of casts over an entire week, you can really save wear and tear on the body with a lighter fly line. The style also permits very long casts with very little room behind the caster. This is a big advantage when the river is high and you don't have much room behind you in order to make the cast. Sinking lines can be very difficult to pull out of the water, and a shorter sinking shooting head in the Scandinavian style is often much more easy to lift from the water before you make your next cast. The style also permits a presentation with a minimum of water disturbance with a floating line because the leader is the primary anchor for the cast. There are some disadvantages to the Scandinavian spey cast as well. One disadvantage is line stripping and how to manage all of that running line. Here's how I do it. Hook the line under my forehand grip, pull the line in. I'll make 3 or 4 pulls and grab a loop of line. I'll then make another 2 or 3 pulls until I reach my overhang, I hook the running line so that it won't get tangled during the shoot, and make the cast. You can troubleshoot the Scandinavian Spey cast by remembering that this is just another kiss and go cast. So all the principles that applied to the standard kiss and go Spey cast also apply to the Scandinavian style of Spey casting. One other thing to keep in mind is the tackle, and the balance of that tackle is critical to this style of casting. Your leader should be at least the length of your rod and preferably longer. And also check the overhang. Overhang, remember, is the amount of running line that you have beyond the tip of the rod, and it's important that you have the right amount, generally about a yard or a meter of running line beyond the tip of the rod before you make the cast. If you have too much line out beyond the tip of the rod, it becomes virtually impossible to make the cast.
As a student of the sport of fly fishing, I really enjoy learning more and more about this sport each and every day. One of my favorite aspects is the dynamics of the single hand and two-handed fly cast. I really enjoy studying and practicing all styles of Spey cast, but what I want to show you today is a Pacific Northwest style, or as some refer to it, the Skagit style Spey cast. This style of Spey casting developed the last 20 years from California to Alaska to meet the needs of steelhead rivers, both coastal and inland. We're often faced with the situation of getting a very large fly and a heavy sink tip out into the river. It doesn't need to be very far, maybe 50 to 100 feet. To use a 10-weight rod to get this heavy sink tip, heavy fly out into the river, it's a little bit overkill. So this style developed to be able to cast very large flies with a lighter gear, better suited to our average steelhead of 7 to 12 pounds. Any size fly rod, from a single hand rod all the way up to a 16-foot two-hander, can be used to perform Pacific Northwest Spey casts. I prefer, for a lot of the steelhead and salmon fishing I do, to use a really light rod. The rod that I'm using is a 1307 LS2 made by Scott. Very, very light in the hand. I can pack this around all day long. I can fish day after day, week on end. Very little fatigue because of the light gear I'm using. One of the biggest differences you'll see in the Skagit gear is the fly line. This fly line is very, very heavy. Equivalent in diameter, probably about a 20-weight fly line in diameter. And that's what it takes to load for a Skagit style cast or Pacific Northwest style Spey cast, a 7-weight fly rod. 15 feet of heavy sink tip on this line. And if I was actually fishing, I could have up to a very, very large fly. General rule for a Pacific Northwest style shooting head is that it's 3 to 3.5 times the length of the rod. The head is very, very short, much like a Scandinavian head. The difference is it's a little heavier and it's always a floater. We're always going to fish short sink tips onto the end or a dry tip, unlike the Scandinavians who would have a full sinking head. Ours is going to be mostly floater with just a sink tip. This allows us maximum versatility, being able to put on multiple tips, looping them on the end, or fish a dry tip if we don't need to get deep. What makes these heads so effective at turning over this dense and heavy sink tip, large fly, is this combination of shortness and heaviness. So these heads will typically go anywhere from 35 to 55 feet in length, depending on the length of your rod. With all the Pacific Northwest style Spey casts, you should perform them slow and in control, with slow you go being your mantra. Let's do one and look at it. Slow lift, slow sweep into the back cast, out she goes. Now, if we think of traditional Spey casting as being the comfortable and elegant Rolls Royce of Spey casting, and Scandinavian style Spey casting being the Ferrari, What that leaves for the Skagit or Pacific Northwest style is an 18-wheeler. Not nearly as exciting, but very purposeful. It's built to deliver maximum payload. And to make it a little more interesting, I like to think of my 18-wheeler is full of beer. Thousands of bottles of beer. So now that I have your attention, I'll show you what I mean. All the corners should be approached like you were turning an 18-wheeler full of beer, not a Ferrari. If I zip around this corner like a Ferrari, mayhem happens. We've probably hooked the trees behind us, we fall apart. Now let me do the same double spay like I'm driving an 18-wheeler full of beer. Come around this corner real nice and slow, and out she goes. No fast and erratic movements. The other common thread that all the Pacific Northwest style spay casts have is that they're all water-loaded casts. They're flop and stop, if you will, instead of the kiss and go of the Scandinavian and traditional spay casts, such as a single spay. Show you what that means. The initial stage of the double spay, notice I'm completely stopped at this point. I can actually pause there 2 to 3 seconds before I sweep and form my back cast. This water load that I'm getting off the surface of the water, throw it into my back cast, is what I'm loading the rod with, unlike the splash and go of a switch cast or single spay. Let me do a couple for you and show you what I mean. Maximum water load all the way around, ripping that line off the water. It's not a rip, really, it's a nice slow move. Remember the beer truck, form our back cast under the rod tip, nice and smooth, water loaded. So that takes me right to the double spay. It's a really important cast. Situation like this where I'm river right, I need to get my fly back out in the river, but I have wind blowing down river. If I just did a single spay here, place my anchor and my back cast upstream of me, that wind's gonna blow it right into me. Might ruin my day if I stick a 3/0 heavily weighted fly into the back of my head. Show you what I mean by that. If I place my anchor and my back cast upstream, that wind could very easily blast that right into me. So what I want to do in this situation is always be safe, keep that fly, sink tip line away from me and downwind of me. I also can't do a switch cast because it's not a change of direction cast. It's going to go straight downstream. I need to get the fly out there. I need a way to keep the anchor and my back cast downwind and downstream of me, at the same time get my fly out into the river. Right now I'll do a double spay and show why it is much more effective in this situation. For my back cast and my forward delivery downstream of me, out of harm's way. The double spay is a 3-part cast. Let's look at stage 1 of the double spay. The goal of stage 1 is to get the fly from directly downstream below us and place it right here, rod tip's length away, downstream from us. The way I'm going to do this is by lifting the rod nice and even, and I'm going to drag and skip the fly up into position. What you want to avoid is making this a cast. This is a short line. We don't need to cast this line. If I start dragging it and flip the rod tip and cast it, the fly's going to go way upstream, improper placement. Very, very critical with this wind blowing that I keep that fly right downstream of me. The way we're going to do this, I'm going to slowly lift, I'm going to drag that fly up, and I'm going to stop the rod, actually rest the rod on my shoulder. The other thing you'll notice is the butt of my rod is pointed toward my target. Drag, point. Also notice I have a little bit of fly line behind me directly opposite my target. That is to maximize the water load on stage 2. So stage 1 is going to lead itself right into stage 2. Let me show you stage 1 one more time. Lift, drag, place, point the butt. I'm ready for stage 2. Stage 2 of the double spay is the formation of the back cast. We've set ourselves up by placing our fly properly right below us. I've got fly line in front of me and behind me, and my rod butt is pointing toward my target. Now, all I need to do is slowly lift that line up and off the water, form my back cast under the rod tip, and then I'm ready for stage 3. Let's look at stage 1 and stage 2 put together. Lift, drag, point, back cast under the rod tip, and out she goes. Let's look at that one more time. I'll freeze frame after I form my back cast on this one. Drag, position, right there. Notice I lifted the line off the water, nice, smooth, and slow. Remember the beer truck. Formed our back cast under our rod tip, and now we're ready for stage 3. Stage 3 of the double spey is the final delivery of the forward stroke, or the final delivery. Just like all spey cast, this cast needs to come from the back cast to a hard stop out here with a nice acceleration leading to that hard stop. Stage 1, nice pause. Stage 2, and final delivery. Really important here with this short line that we have a short to medium length stroke on our forward cast. I don't want to waste the energy coming back to here and going all the way forward. Now the forward stroke on the double spey, no different than any other spey cast. I'm just gonna go from here to there. Notice I want a nice high stop of that rod, form a nice tight loop, get the fly out to the fish. Stage 1, drag, point, back cast under the rod tip, out she goes in the middle of the river. We're fishing. The next cast we're going to look at is the circle spey, or sea spey. So this is a cast that's great for casting heavy sink tips and really large flies, and it's good in wind or non-windy conditions. Now the circle spey is a 3-stage cast. Let's look at stage 1. Okay, that's stage 1. Our object here is to bring the fly from directly downstream after the swing and reposition the fly right beside my casting shoulder. To do this, I'm going to slowly lift the rod tip up, out toward the center of the river, and back under. I'm going to accelerate right under this backward capital C that I'm drawing. Lift, out, under. The fly has repositioned right into the anchor position, ready for stage 2 and 3 of this cast. Let me do it one more time. Straight up, out, under. Fly has landed in the perfect position, ready for stage 2 and 3 of this cast. So we'll move on to stage 2 and 3 of the circle spey. What you're going to notice right away is that this is very, very similar, almost identical to what you saw in the double spey. We're going to sweep the line off the water, lifting as we go, forming a back cast under the rod tip, opposite our target, and then fire our delivery right toward our target. I'll show you what a couple of these look like. Stage 2, under the rod tip, out toward the target. Let me do that one more time. Get the fly back downstream. Stage 1, lift, under. Stage 2, sweep. Stage 3, out into the river. That's the circle spey. As a side note, I'd like to talk about where the circle spey came from, or sea spey. Back in the early 90s, a guide from the Skagit River by the name of John Farrar came up with a cast called the Snap T to replace the single spey, as it was a little bit easier to remove a heavy fly, heavy sink tip from downstream below him, get it into the anchor position and fire it upstream. His original cast looked something like this. Let me get the fly downstream here. Original cast was a lift followed by a pretty quick snap move, like that. Notice the fly is right beside my casting shoulder, so at this point I could go ahead and sweep 2 and 3, and it's identical to the circle spey. Very, very, very similar cast. Only difference is stage 1, bringing the fly from downstream to right here. Show you what that looks like again. Notice if I keep this cast really low, I can avoid obstacles, trees and limbs overhanging the river. Very good cast for getting out of trouble. Another Skagit River guide saw John doing this fly, good friends with John, and a buddy of mine, Deck Hogan. He saw this cast and he said, wait a minute, I can I see something here. Let's take a little bit of that snap out of it. Let's make it a little more fly fishing like. Rounded it out just a little bit. I'll show you what that looks like. He took that original slash and dash move and just rounded it out a little bit. Flop, flies in the exact same position. Now to teach this to his students, he started elongating it and exaggerating it, therefore making a big circle, a little less of a tight C and more of a big circle. And that's how he came up with the name circle cast or circle spey or sea spey. Now this big wide one works great for showing somebody how easy and soft the cast can be, even with a heavy sink tip and a big fly. But it's maybe a little less efficient because the wind can blow it around. So if you just take the move, tighten it up just a little bit, and then you get the circle spey or sea spey. There's many variations to stage one of the circle spey, snap tee, all the snap set of casts. As long as they take the fly from downstream and put it opposite our right shoulder, they'll all work. You can do a real low snap move, you can do the real large circle, you can do more of a shallow C. We can snap it up under the rod tip, a little higher, we can go around the back. Point is, I don't really care which one you do, as long as you know one and you have good control of that cast, get that fly right where we need it. Beautiful cast for getting heavy flies out of the water, heavy sink tips, presenting them to the fish. Next cast I want to talk about is the Perry poke. This is a cast that you can use in place of a snap tee or single spey. Great cast for casting huge flies, heavy sink tips, or anytime there's an upstream wind. Now before I get into the cast, I'm going to talk about how it came about. Famous, very good Skagit River steelhead guide, Ed Ward, saw a buddy of his by the name of Perry use this move to bail out of a blown single spey. As Ed saw this cast happen, he decided and figured out how he could turn this into a very fishable cast. I'll show you the original cast, how it started. As we make a single spey, I'm gonna purposely blow the anchor placement. Say I have a big fly on and oh, the anchor's a little too low. Darn it. Throw that out, and I can come back and still get the fly out and fish it through the swing. And then as it comes back around, I'm gonna think about, as my fly's fishing, how am I gonna fix my single spey? Well, I swing through the run. By the time it gets down below me, I forgot all about what I was gonna do and splash. That's wrong again. Poke it out and just get it out fishing. Ed's following his buddy down through the run. He sees this going on. And he says, wait a minute. I really like the idea of maximum water load to send these huge flies up out of the water and across the river. Let's see how we can turn that into a cast. Lo and behold, he came up with a great cast. So here it is. We're going to walk you through the Perry poke. Stage one, and the object of stage one, is to get the fly to splash down by our right shoulder. What we're going to use is the same moves we start with in a single spey. We're going to lift, sweep back into this position, and we want the fly to splash down right beside our right shoulder. This is a 4-stage cast. I'm just going to do stage one. Up, sweep, splash. Stage one. Flies right where it needs to be. Just like starting a single spey. So now stage two is the poke or the flop. Stage one, splash. Stage two, poke or the flop. Now notice my rod tip is touching the water. This is pretty important. As I come around to form my back cast under my rod tip, I'm going to be able to get a maximum water load from low to high because of my rod position. Splash, flop. Form the back cast under the rod. Out she goes to the middle of the river. Let me show you that again. Notice the last two stages are just the same back cast and forward cast that we've seen on the double spey and the snap tee and circle spey. Up, sweep, splash, flop. You can pause about as long as you want here. Under the rod tip, out into the river. It's important to be really slow on these casts. Up, slow, splash, flop, back, and fire. The reason why we'd use this cast, the Perry poke, instead of a single spey, sometimes with a single spey with a heavy, heavy sink tip, no matter how hard and high we lift the rod, we just can't quite bring that fly out of the water and still have an accurate placement of the fly. So if we're casting boat-sized flies, this is a very good cast because it's easy to stop. We have a little more forgiving area. We can land the fly before we do the poke, sweep back, which lines everything up, 180 degrees to our target, bomb, out to the target. Let me do a couple more, show you what I mean. Up, sweep, splash, flop it, and this is where everything's gonna line up in the back cast, and out she goes. Perry poke, out and fishing. Next thing I wanna do is show you what can go wrong with the Skagit cast so that you can troubleshoot these casts when you're out on the river with your buddies fishing. The thing with stage one that can go wrong with any of them, Perry poke, circle spey, snap tee, double spey, is that everything doesn't line up in a 180-degree plane from our back cast to our target. If I were to fire the fly too far upstream, say on a snap tee, and I come back to here, I've got a large L shape in my fly line. Instead of having my fly lined up right here, my sink tip lined up directly in line, my back cast directly in line and opposite my target, got my back cast part of my line going toward my target and the terminal end going upstream. This big L shape is going to be a problem. I'll show you what it looks like. If I go too far upstream, I come back and I really have to pound it hard to get it out of the water. If it's an extreme example, it just won't come out of the water. It'll kind of flop over, look really ugly, very, very inefficient. The opposite end of the spectrum is the fly being too far downstream. Same thing that's gonna happen on a Perry poke, circle spey, double spey, it doesn't matter, all the Skagit casts. If I don't give it enough oomph or lift high enough to get that sink tip out of the water and the fly stays downstream of me, show you what this looks like. I'm lifting, but not quite enough. Splashes down. Well, my fly's not in the right position. If I try and execute this cast, I'm gonna tangle myself, I'm gonna tangle the rod. No good. So now let's look at some of the problems that can happen on the second stage of the Skagit cast. The second stage for most of these casts is the sweep stage. We're gonna sweep the line off the water and form our back cast. Very common problems here are the dip. We'll start with that one. So I'll do my stage one. I come up and I dip down and I've just made a big macrame mess and then I've got to huck it up and over to get that fly out of the water. Very, very inefficient. Show you what that looks like again. Come up, stage one. Stage two, I come up and down and then out. A lot of energy to rip that fly out of the water. You're gonna hear it ripping and you're gonna have to overpower your cast. The reason why this is really important not to get into the habit of is you will overpower every forward cast and it's really hard to come back and find out just how little effort it's gonna take to actually send that fly out there. Very, very common. For some reason, this move just feels like it ought to be right. What we wanna do and what's important is that the line is lifting off the water the entire time up into the back cast position. What I'd like you to imagine is if I laid out a piece of masking tape across a flat table and I was to grab the far end of that masking tape and peel it off that table. Now imagine if I came up, as I was pulling it up, I pulled it straight up off the table and then dipped and then came back up. Probably the tape would tear and not come off the table. Now imagine I'm lifting that tape right up off the table. Just watch this section of fly line as it comes off the water. It's gonna come off just like I'm pulling up tape real nice and evenly. We're not gonna see that line go back down and stick to the water. I'll show you the dip again. Watch, imagine this is tape coming off a table and how ineffective this would be to get tape off that table. The next most, and very common as well, thing we're gonna talk about, and that is cutting the corner, coming to here and chopping up. If I watch this move all the way around, nice and slow, lifting the line off the water, then I'm probably not going to cut that corner or dip. Brings me to a point I'd like to make. When we're learning to spey cast, those that can use their eyes and use the visual cues, whether it be the back cast, the pulling of the line off the water, the lifting of the line downstream, use those eyes, you'll learn the cast a lot quicker. We're not casting to rising trout out there. There's no reason for me to stare out at my target the whole time. It's a waste of my eyeballs. I'm going to use those eyes to tell me what my cast is doing. And that's what I'm asking you to do right here with the masking tape analogy. I'm going to lift that line up off the water. Out she goes. Let me show you cutting the corner again. Cutting the corner looks like this. To here and then up and out. Notice what happened when I cut the corner is I did not form a back cast under my rod tip. If I cut that corner, if I come to here and then up and over, the rod tip's got nowhere to go but up and over and down. Very opposite of under the rod tip, what we want in a proper spey back cast. The other problem that's very common that you see when somebody's learning the circle spey or the snap tee is stopping the rod out in front of them. It has two negative things. One's very obvious. The fly's coming from downriver to above us. Very easy for that big fly to run into our rod and possibly break it. The other thing is it leaves us very little room to load the rod. I'll show you what I mean. If I do my circle part or snap part and I leave the rod up here, whammo. Fly's gonna whack the rod, possibly break it. If I'm lucky, I just get a tangle out of the deal. If I'm lucky enough and the fly does make it over, like that, now I have very little room to load the rod into my back cast for my forward stroke. Very important we get that rod under the fly as it's coming out of the way. Two things, I'm not going to hit my rod, and also I'm going to have a big long sweep to create my back cast. Now let's talk about the final stage of any spey cast, and that's the forward delivery. Some very common problems with these, and a lot of them stem from problems we have with other stages of these casts. As we go to make our forward cast, we have the bloody L, as we talked about, the big L shape in the water, or the big pile anchor, and as we go forward, we have to use a lot of power to rip that fly out of the water. This is a way to identify if you've developed some bad habits in your forward stroke. Remember, what we want is to accelerate to a hard stop of the rod with any spey cast. Here's what happens though, we see this quite a bit. As I come back up here, I'm going to do my forward stroke. I get to here and I creep all the way to here while I'm waiting for that line to clear. Now I've got nowhere to go but a short stroke down to the water. I'll show you what that looks like in real time. I come up to here, I creep forward, and then I got to go down. But you can see how ineffective that is going to be when we're talking about stroke length. Even though there's a short line, I'm using a short stroke, I still need from here to here. If I creep all the way down to here, I've got nowhere to go but down. It's not going to be a good cast, not an efficient cast. The other one is what I like to call Larry the Lurcher. This one looks like this. Oh, we're set up perfect and snap. You could probably hear that fly pop. Show you what that looks like again. Instead of a nice smooth acceleration, it's just a big fast lurch forward. Goes out there, but it's not pretty. Last one is not using your two hands together. Using that pivot point. It's what I call the big sweep all the way down to the water. Stops the rod right down to the water, and what's essentially happening is we're just using the top hand right over the top. Just like that. Instead of the two hands together to make the snap. I'll show you what that looks like. Everything's real nice into the back cast, and then up and over, big barrel roll, open loop. I'll shoot some line on this one so you can really see it. Back, big giant loop, a sink tip to fly, everything lands in a pile. It's out there, it's fishing, it's not very efficient. Remember what we want to do on our forward stroke, nice clean acceleration to the stop. With Skagit style spey casting, there are some disadvantages. The first would be stripping all this line. If I make a 100-foot plus cast, I'm gonna have a lot of running line to deal with. If we're making a long cast, I'm gonna have to strip a lot of line, count my coils, stack them up before each and every cast can be made. Most people would consider that a nuisance. Second disadvantage to this system is it's not ideal for really long casts. If I wanted to make really long casts, present the fly very, very far away, the small rod that I'm using here and the very heavy line are not ideal for turning over at great distance. I would, at that point, probably choose a Scandinavian kit or a traditional kit with a long-bellied line. The other disadvantage to the Skagit style casts are that they sometimes have more moves to accomplish the same thing you can do with less moves in the other spey casts. For example, the Perry Poke has 4 moves in what you could accomplish with 2 with a single spey. I'll show you what I mean. Single spey, lift it up, set it down, out she goes. 2 moves. Very simple, quick, and efficient. But if I've got a really large fly on, I'm gonna have to make that into 4 moves with a Perry Poke. Choosing a spey castle that's right for you, you need to weigh benefits and disadvantages to every one. Every one of the styles has its plus and minuses. However, you need to deliver very, very large flies and heavy sink tips, short to medium ranges, say out to about 90 feet. The Skagit system might be right for you. We've talked about short-bellied lines and long-bellied lines. What we haven't talked about yet is right in between the two, a mid-bellied line. This line here is a 75-foot head, splitting the difference between the short shooting heads we talked about earlier and the long-bellied line that Way was fishing. This particular line, 75-foot head, is made by scientific anglers. By choosing a mid-belly spey line, I can take advantage of the pluses and minuses of both the short head and the long head. If I'm tucked in tight against the bank, I don't have as much line to form my back cast as I would with a long-bellied line. And if I'm casting great distances in the river, I do not have to strip quite as much line as I would with a short head. If you only had to pick one line, mid-belly line would be the way to go.
What we'd like to do now is show you a simple strategy for casting and fishing more safely in windy conditions. Over the course of this DVD, we've covered a number of casts that have upstream anchors and a number of casts that have downstream anchors. Remember, the anchor is nothing more than the position of the end of the line and leader at the conclusion of the back cast before your forward cast. The upstream anchor casts that we've covered include the single spey, the spiral single, the circle C or the circle cast, the snap T, and the Perry Poke. The downstream anchor casts that we've covered include the double spey and the snake roll. In windy conditions, you always want to make sure that your anchor is downwind of you, meaning that the anchor is not between you and the wind. In this situation, I've got a little wind blowing from upstream to downstream. Where I want my anchor is not upstream of me, but downstream. Really, this gives us a choice of just 2 casts, and that's the snake roll or the double spey. I'm going to do a snake roll here. Notice that the position of the anchor was well away from me. Even if the wind puffs up, the fly line and the fly itself is going to be away from me so that there's less of a chance that it's going to blow into me and hook me while I'm casting. Similarly, I could do a double spey. What's the danger of picking the wrong cast? If we put an upstream anchor cast in this situation with the wind coming down, and I'll do a single spey, disaster may occur. Now, if that was a real cast with a big fly, like a 3/0 spey fly, you can imagine the consequences, and they're not pretty. Another strategy for casting in the wind is not to try to cast too far. It may be a testosterone thing, but a lot of guys pick up a 15 or 16 foot rod and they immediately feel that they have to cast to the other bank. Well, there may be fish on the other bank, but there's probably just as many fish on your bank. Especially in windy situations, shorten up a little bit to a distance where you know you can get the fly to turn over every time. Another thing when we're casting in windy situations is you might want to change the trajectory of your cast. Rather than having the line lay out 5 feet above the water and then risk the possibility that the wind may blow it down, bring the trajectory of your cast down closer to the water. That may mean bringing the casting plane from a more vertical orientation to a little more horizontal. Here, I'm going to try to get the fly to just land and straighten out just before it touches the water. In a situation like that, the fly turns over just before it hits the water, and it's less likely to be blown around by the wind. Let's look at the next cast where the trajectory is high. Notice how even though the fly turned over, it's getting blown back by the wind. This fly won't be fishing effectively for quite a while. Now, in order to cast effectively, one must practice, because that's the only way you can develop a feel for all the parts of fly casting. There's a feel in the rod, there's a feel when the rod's loading properly, there's a feel in the timing and the development of the timing for your casts. When you're practicing, make sure that you're using consistent equipment, because if every time you go out to cast, you're choosing a different rod, a different line, or a different setup, it's going to be very hard to develop a consistent feel for what's actually happening in the cast. We also think it's very important to practice for casting further or improving your distance. Why is that important? Because in order to cast further and further, it requires your technique to get better and better. If you're in a fishing situation where you have a headwind and you can only cast about 60 feet on a good day, you'll probably only be able to cast 25 feet. And if the fish are 60 feet out, you're not going to catch any. On the other hand, if you're able to cast 100 feet on a good day and you have that same headwind, you'll be able to reach those fish that are 60 feet out. When you're practicing to gauge your progress, mark your lines every 10 feet. Then you'll have a very consistent and very obvious measure of whether you're making any improvements or not. All Spey casts share in common a back cast made under the rod tip, a little bit of line and leader on the water right before we make our forward cast. If you understand the mechanics of what govern the back cast under the rod tip, the forward cast, and you understand how to place and shape your anchor, you can make any Spey cast. I'm going to show you a variety of Spey casts, and I want you to look for that back cast made under the rod tip, just a little bit of line and leader on the water before the forward cast. It doesn't matter what type of Spey cast you do, the forward casting mechanics don't change at all.
Well, that's it. In this DVD, we've shown you a variety of casting tools, as well as the advantages of Scandinavian, Pacific Northwest, and traditional styles of Spey casting. We've emphasized that all fly casts are governed by the same principles. We love fly casting and Spey fishing, and we hope that you enjoy your time on the water as much as we do. And join us for our next DVD, when we'll all go fishing.
As instructors and avid fly fishermen, we spend a lot of time outdoors. We've been fortunate to have the opportunity to fish in places all over the world. If there's anything we've learned, it means everything to have the right tools for the job. This, our sponsors understand. There are no shortcuts to making a quality product.
Scientific Anglers leads the industry in innovative fly line design and construction. Built to perform and last, Scientific Anglers lines are exhaustively researched and tested and perform the best for their designed applications. One example of Scientific Anglers' innovation and dedication to the sport is the success of the XLT long belly spey line. Originally designed to improve the efficiency of spey fishing for the average caster, the XLT has also revolutionized distance casting in competitions around the world.
Scott fly rods are designed by hardcore fishermen for hardcore fishermen. Each line of rods is designed to be the best at meeting your specific fishing requirements. Every rod is built individually by hand in Colorado by people who know and love fly fishing. 4 years in development, the LS2 is the lightest, most versatile, and affordable two-handed rod for all types of spey casting. Simms only makes fly fishing products. If you want to be warm, dry, and comfortable on the water, you don't have to look any further than Simms. You must protect your eyes when you're fishing. A great pair of polarized sunglasses not only protects your eyes, but allows you to see what others can't. Whether you are practicing casting in your backyard or taking the trip of a lifetime, Maui Jims are the best. Since 1897, Filson has made durable clothing, footwear, and accessories specifically for people who make a living in the outdoors. Filson products are made so well, they will last generations. Might as well have the best.
The Imperial River Company has been a very unique opportunity for us. What brought us here and made us want to be part of this business was the opportunity to live in a small town and then to interact with people from all over the U.S. and all over the world on a consistent basis.
There are distinct seasons in Maupin as far as the different types of people that come. In the spring we have trout season, and there's lots of folks that come to fish for the trout in the river, and that moves us into the summer recreation season, which is definitely the whitewater rafting time. And so that's when a lot of families come out, and you see lots of people on summer vacation, doing things with their kids. And that puts us on into Labor Day. Labor Day kind of marks the beginning of steelhead season and when the fishermen start coming out. And so then it turns to all of these fishermen that have made this their destination. It makes what we do very exciting because it's always changing into a new group of folks. We've done what we've done with our rooms, which is they are all decorated differently. They're all each unique. We've done that because we want people to remember where they stayed. We've also done that as a tribute to our area and to our state. Oregon is very unique in its geography. So many natural resources available out there, and so we've tried to highlight some of those by having the rooms decorated and themed, if you will.
A lot of times when people leave, they give us some really good feedback on the place, and they say, so-and-so treated us really well in the restaurant last night. We had a great steak from the ranch, and we had such a good day on the river. The fishing was great. I just love it here. I'll be back. That's what we really like to hear. We'll be back.
Well, the Deschutes is a world-renowned fishery, has been, for trout and steelhead. It's still kind of a diamond in the rough, but it's, I think, one of the 10 best rivers in the West. It's the canyon sort of embraces you. Fishing in the Deschutes, and personally I think is second to none. You have an indigenous trout, a gene pool all its own, and then you have a world-renowned steelhead fishery with very exciting wild fish, and that's always been attractive to me. And so as far as I'm concerned, it's one of the best fisheries in the world. Our client base is all over the United States and really all over the world. During the tourism season, we get people from France, Italy, Germany, Holland, England, New Zealand, and they come here because they know the quality of the fishery on the Deschutes. Some of them come for trout, some of them come for steelhead, some of them come for both. I get asked a lot, if I guarantee fish, and I always guarantee that there's fish in the river. As a matter of fact, about 2,000 per running mile as far as the trout population. And I guarantee I'll put people on those fish, but the rest is up to the fish. But yeah, it's a lot of fun. It's very challenging and very rewarding. So I love it.
It's amazing to see.
I know we got it on the